Hi, my name is Martin Köring. I'm the head of Economist Impact's World Ocean Initiative, which imagines an ocean in robust health and with a vital economy. The World Ocean Summit is an integral part of the work we do on accelerating sustainable ocean economy. You can find out more about the initiative's work, including the coverage of key themes discussed during the summit, on our website, ocean.economist.com. So I'm joined today actually by two of my colleagues to discuss, what's happened at COP26 and particularly what we think about the ocean theme and whether the ocean was and how the ocean was covered at COP26 and the role of the ocean when it comes to climate change. So just in terms of, and this is more an informal conversation, talking about our experiences at COP and of covering COP. So let's start maybe with just kind of our key takeaways. So maybe I will just start briefly in terms of what my key impressions were. I mean, I was at COP, and I mean, one thing that I noticed that was really important is actually that this ocean climate biodiversity nexus was actually on the agenda. I mean, there were sessions that focused on that, and even the conversations around COP26 mentioned the ocean climate nexus and the broader ocean climate biodiversity nexus. So really putting the ocean on the agenda at COP26. Whether that was enough is something that we can discuss about today. But obviously, it was on the agenda. Nature was on the agenda more broadly. Some people have said this was kind of a nature COP. Clearly, there was a focus on forests, which is, of course, another key ecosystem. I was at the World Biodiversity Summit, which is a side session at COP26. And one of the other speakers there, the CEO of the Capitals Coalition, Mark Gove, was saying that 92% of the declarations coming out of COP26 reference nature. And that's something really unprecedented. I mean, we haven't seen that before. So bringing nature on the climate agenda is absolutely crucial. And as we know, there are conferences, not only this year, but next year, that look at biodiversity as well. And seeing that continuum is really important. Of course, there was an Ocean Action Day, and we covered that day extensively. There was a declaration, the Ocean for Climate Declaration, endorsed by more than 100 civil society organizations. The US joined the high-level panel for sustainable ocean economy. So there are clearly announcements that were important. And the things that stood out, of course, is this big marine protected area, the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor in South America, with Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Panama signing up for that. So clearly also like a practical measure to build one of the kind of largest and most biologically diverse corridors in the world. And of course, there were lots of announcements on finance broadly, but also on blue finance specifically. And that's very encouraging because blue finance is one of the three pillars or the levers of change we have identified at the World Ocean Initiative. So the Blue Bond for Belize, for example, the Ocean Risk and Resilience Alliance announced mobilization of new investment with corporate partners, such as AXA, Google, and others. And of course, there's also the Pro Blue fund that got further support. This is a fund administered by the World Bank. And then finally, also the Great Blue Wall, which is kind of a new initiative that is, that aims to strengthen resilience in, Western Indian Ocean nations. So clearly, some, positive announcements. But what we heard more broadly is lots of pledges, lots of announcements. But the big question is, what do we do next? I mean, can we really put these things into action? But I was positively surprised, let's say. Maybe the expectation was pretty low, but having the ocean on the agenda, having biodiversity and nature on the agenda, I see as a positive thing. So I'd like to ask you as well, Nelly and Oliver, maybe Nelly, I mean, you covered this on a daily basis, really. I mean, what have you seen in terms of ocean being on the agenda at COP?
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. So I was definitely sort of the man in the chair, as it were. I wasn't physically at COP, but I was sort of monitoring all the different sessions every single day and kind of deep diving into what was going on. And I think similarly, there was a focus on nature and biodiversity at this COP, more so than ever before, which is really encouraging. Whether those pledges and promises, actually turn into action is questionable. But I'm hopeful. I think as well, I think the private sector stepped up in a way that, again, I haven't really seen before. They were kind of sort of leading on a lot of financial commitments and sort of maybe potentially filling that gap where governments are sort of falling behind, especially around the 100 billion, dollars a year promise. And while I think another sort of my key takeaways, there were so many issues at this COP around sort of access and representation. However, there were certain things in a couple of the ocean actions that I thought were actually quite positive. And one of those was in the announcement of the sort of infrastructure for resilient island states, for small island resilient island states, IRIS. And that was sort of supported by India, the UK, and Australia, and a few other stakeholders. And there's sort of three pillars of actions around this new initiative. And one of those pillars specifically focuses on gender equality and disability, and involving different communities, but specifically gender equality and disability equality. And I thought that was actually something I'd never seen before and a massive step forward. And again, how they actually implement that and how that comes to life will be interesting to witness. And then another sort of related thing that I noticed when the announcement of the sort of the Big Blue Wall, which is sort of like a collaboration to create these protected areas for Western Indian Ocean states. There was a big emphasis on including Indigenous communities and community action at every level of that plan, which again I think is a big step forward, bringing in those voices. Even though again there were quite a lot of issues around who were the actual voices in those spaces of power at COP. Were they actually getting a lot of representation? There was some missing people from some key Pacific Island states and small island developing states who just had absolutely no representation. And obviously those are the ones, those are some of the most vulnerable states when it comes to all of this. So I think so positive things, but also I'm still a bit skeptical on how all of this will actually be implemented.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you mentioned the key words like access and representation. That was a broader issue, as you know, at COP26, not only when it came to the ocean conversations, but the broader conversation around, are we including the people that are, at the heart of this? Oliver, also wanted to go to you. I mean, Nelly and I, we kind of focus on the ocean on a daily basis. You focus on a lot of things, and you attended a lot of sessions and you were around. What was your impression in terms of the ocean being on the agenda at COP26?
Well, you're very kind, Martin. I'd rather say that I'm actually fairly unfocused in general. And it's very easy to be unfocused at COP. I think it's very hard to give an impression to people who haven't experienced one of these things, quite what a vast bazaar it is. That's bizarre as in lots of shops, but also bizarre as in very strange, because you have so many different voices, different conversations going on at the same time. And one of the mantras that we came up with when we were doing the Economist podcast, that series that went up to the COP, was it's never really either or, it's almost always both and. And that's I think where someone taking a general view would not necessarily have noticed an oceans emphasis. They would have noticed a nature emphasis, as people said. But there is so much going on, and it was not at the top of. I don't think it was certainly wasn't the top of the British presidency agenda, which was famously summed up as coal, cars, cash, and trees. And those were the focuses of big announcements. I wasn't actually there all the time, so I wasn't actually there on Oceans Day, but it was quite easy to miss an emphasis on the oceans if you were looking at the big thing, because the big thing is always couched in the form of territorial nations facing off against each other. And the ocean's main role in the discourse is not as some sort of potential savior. It's as a problem that is creeping up shorelines all around the world. And so first order, if you were the journalist from Mars coming in, you would not have connected the discussions going on in that vast campus alongside the Clyde with the Clyde itself, one of Britain's great navigable waterways leading out into the oceans of the world. So yes, there was more oceans, but you should absolutely not think that this was sort of like the definitive breakthrough for the oceans. That said, I know a lot of people who are tracking this were very encouraged by the degree to which oceans are now being built into all the different work packages of the actual UNFCCC process. And I think it was definitely the case that you could feel in scientific discussions the impact of the IPCC's special report on the oceans and cryosphere. So that's good, but you should also look at the fact that, for instance, the Glasgow Pact doesn't actually use the word ocean other than in the preamble. In the preamble, I think it's exactly the same boilerplate about the ocean as is in the Paris Agreement. I'm not a minute tracker of these things, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. Language in the conference decision, which is sort of like one of the big overview things, language in the conference decision about nature-based solutions was removed and replaced, I think, with something about emphasis on restoring nature and ecosystems. So again, that's restoring, not seeing as a solution. So I think there's still a fair way to go on that front. I definitely wouldn't. I would. It may look like a breakthrough, but it will only do so in retrospect if a lot more happens. It didn't feel like an ocean breakthrough when you were on the ground.
That's really good to kind of highlight as well, Oliver, and Nelly, I got to you. I mean, the fact that, if you're in the ocean bubble in a way, then you're thinking, yes, the ocean was mentioned, but because you're looking for the ocean.
Absolutely.
So it's really the kind of psychological element. Sorry, Nelly, you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to jump in and say, I think because I was sort of hyper-focused on finding those ocean-themed messages, I think for someone who's only looking for that, it might have been like, oh, there was actually quite a lot going on. But even during Ocean Day at COP, there was still a lot of other conversations that took precedence in the news cycle, and it wasn't really mentioned at all. So I think if you were sort of looking specifically for it, it seemed quite encouraging, but otherwise it really just got buried in a lot of other big announcements. And I just wanted to, it's a bit cheesy, but I think kind of to your point, Oliver, about how, discussions at COP tend to focus on so many other things than oceans. Sylvia Earle had the most amazing quote, and I'm going to read it because it was really powerful. And she said, there's such a focus on atmosphere, but we're really missing the point if we miss the ocean, because after all, the ocean drives climate and weather, and it's home to almost all life on Earth. You take away the ocean, there is no climate. If you take away the ocean, there is no life. And I don't know, that was such a powerful quote about all of this. So I just wanted to throw it in this discussion.
Yes, and that makes sense. And actually, there was this powerful image of, of the, I think that, the foreign minister of Tuvalu, who's actually also going to be part of a panel discussion at the summit, who was knee deep, underwater when he giving his address, and this just highlighted, the existential threat as well that some countries, especially small island nations, face, but. Oliver, you also highlighted that, that a lot of people still look at the ocean as part of a bigger problem. As part of climate, there's a problem with the ocean. There's ocean risk, ocean challenges with like typhoons, hurricanes, tsunamis, all these kind of things, rather than looking at the positive things that the ocean can contribute. But even on that aspect of those existential threats, and I think Peter Thompson in his address mentioned that, many of those countries that are facing the biggest problems that are kind of coming from climate change, but are represented by ocean challenges in terms of sea level rise, and the island nations, they have not done really nothing to kind of contribute to climate change, because they have almost, no greenhouse gas emissions, but they are the ones that are, suffering the most. And that's something that Peter Thompson also highlighted. And there were, this was the first COP that fossil fuels were even mentioned. I mean, it's just kind of, you would think like, oh, that's like so logical. Or coal, that, that we have this coal pledge, and people were disappointed that that the language was watered down. But ultimately, the biggest aspect here is actually bringing down greenhouse gas emissions. So the overall climate conversation will have a massive impact on the ocean, on those ocean threats. I mean, we have the 100 billion per year announcement. I mean, that the finance package that hasn't really been reached, and so on, and all these kind of things affect small island nations. And I think one of the biggest shocks was for many delegates that this report came out by Climate Action Tracker during the session and during the conference, saying that even with all those nice commitments, by 2030, we were still on track to actually 2.4 degrees warming by 2001. 2100, the year 21. So it's really, we're not really on track. And many of those island states will be swallowed, so it's really, really tricky for those countries. So do you think that these existential risks faced by many of these countries have really been captured by this COP, despite all of those announcements?
Well, I do think that you see, Martin, that you see the importance of the fact that 1.5, this extraordinarily ambitious, and I think people are losing track of how ambitious 1.5 is, but the fact that the 1.5 goal was certainly not backpedaled from, and the language allowed you to say that it was stressed, and that was, of course, a small island state breakthrough in Paris with the Climate Vulnerable Forum. I think the fact that 1.5 remains key to the language reflects some of those worries. My worry is that I think 1.5 is not, as you were saying, compatible with anything like the actions that are currently going on. But there's something else you said there that made me sort of like, in my role here as the person who sits back and doesn't look at the ocean all the time, I think there is a point that COPs are incredibly focused on emissions. It's hard for adaptation to get its due regard at COPs. And of course, oceans are, thank God, not a source of emissions other than from shipping, the oceans themselves. So when you talk about the forest dynamic, you have forests as both endangered and thus emitting, and also potential sinks. Whereas the ocean doesn't have a role in our discussions that's as active as that. As I say, the ocean is the thing that climate change, some vague hyper object, is pushing up onto your beaches and over your seawalls, but it doesn't feature as a part of the whole discussion quite the same way. I don't know, and maybe that's too philosophical for this stage in the day, but that's my feeling. The ocean still feels effectively treated as a passive thing to a large extent in the broader climate discussion.
Yes, that's a great point. Sorry, Nelly. Yeah.
Well, and on that point too, I think it's so hard to sort of think about the ocean sometimes in terms of climate action, because there really is, it's such an ephemeral thing to try and govern ocean spaces. I mean, it's a challenge for everyone beyond, governing for protected areas to make sure that we have enough blue carbon and all of the things that was talked about during this COP. And I think again, like it's hard for people to really sort of tackle with that. And in terms of sort of whether small island developing states were really and the massive threat that faces them was paid enough attention to at COP, I do think that, and again, unlike any other COP that I've sort of monitored or witnessed, small island developing states were given a lot of attention and the challenges that they faced, which was good. But again, it almost seemed like a lot of talk. I remember in the second day when they announced that the Iris initiative that I talked about before, you had the UK ministers from the UK, India and Australia almost sort of like trying to vie, like, I'm giving this much to the project, but don't worry, I'm also giving more. Like, it was like this big show of like, oh no, we definitely support, all of these states. We have their interests at heart. They're the most. It was so much rhetoric which is sort of like all of COP, right? But the numbers they're talking about were like 9 million, 10 million. Like what? That's nothing when you think it's like actually going to take trillions to protect and help these nations adapt and mitigate to climate change. And that's not even talking about loss and damage, which is a whole other very sticky subject and was completely left out of the final document. So it's just.
I don't think you should say loss and damage. The purpose of loss and damage is to stay in. That's a victory. Loss and damage is one of the things where if you don't get it taken down, then it's a victory, even if it doesn't move forward. Certainly that, I think, is the way that the people pushing hard for loss and damage see it. They will, as long as they are still in the next round, they think that it's not what they want, but I don't think loss and damage really took a step backwards. I think the fact that it persists, and I'm sure that it will come back in a big way at Sharm el-Sheikh, which will presumably be, there have of course been other COPs that have been reasonably close to reefs, but it will be interesting to see what the optics of that are. But yeah, loss and damage, there is no progress, but that doesn't mean that there's failure as yet.
Yes, I mean, you're right.
Right, but I think the lack of sort of forward movement was slightly, I guess I wish I had seen a little bit more movement and concrete measures in that declaration, but lack of concrete measures is sort of.
Yeah, sometimes the lack of regress is already something to celebrate, unfortunately. But I mean, just speaking about that, and I mean, we talked about the lack of really acknowledging the scale of the problem for many small island developing countries, and in fact, many other countries as well around the world that will be directly affected by ocean risks in a way because of climate change. But then the narrative is still about suffering and still about the negative consequences. And Oliver, you mentioned that the forest, often the conversation is more about the capacity of forests and planting forests and how that has all this kind of positive impact. But then that's really surprising that the ocean narrative hasn't moved in that direction as much. And I know Peter Thompson talked about that yesterday, talking about things like sustainable aquaculture. I think the ocean could provide 6 times more sustainable food than it does today if sustainable aquaculture was featured. And this is something that the World Ocean Initiative covers a lot on our platform. And of course, decarbonization of shipping, you mentioned, Oliver, and then there's also all the potential in terms of restoration of mangrove, seagrass, kind of ocean-based ecosystems that has this huge opportunity to harness the ocean as a carbon sink. And then the energy conversation. I mean, often COP is about energy and purely about energy. And in fact, this is really encouraging to see that COP is looking at all these other things, nature, biodiversity, methane, and so on, and coal, but energy has always been the main focus of COP. But the fact that the ocean could provide so much more energy when it comes to things like offshore wind, but even wave and tidal and these kind of things. And it's really a shame that really hasn't happened. And I know Peter Thompson is also very passionate about that. We actually just released a report recently on ocean climate solutions. But how can we really turn the narrative around that the ocean is seen as a source of great solutions to tackle climate change?
Turning narratives around is, it's like turning super tankers around. It's not something that you undertake lightly. It's very interesting for me listening to what you say there, Martin. It does strike me in retrospect, the degree to which the food conversation has been dominated by plant-based meat substitutes rather than aquaculture is really interesting. And I think that's a place where people could really start to think more deeply about things. I think that people have, and you'll forgive the slightly spatial, I think people have a view of mangroves and things like that as good, but quite literally peripheral. They're around the edges of things. They're not central. They feel like, as it were, nice to have. But there's also the question of, there was a famous plaque that Colin Powell had on his desk at the Pentagon saying there's no limit to what you can do as long as other people get the credit. And to some extent, I don't think we should necessarily measure things in terms of how much the ocean per se is mentioned. I think mainlining the ocean into other discussions is possibly far more long-term powerful. And that's why I slightly worry about statements like Sylvia's about the absolute primacy of the ocean, because that feels very much like, give us our room, take us seriously. Whereas I think the point is to actually just push away in all the areas at making sure that the ocean perspective is represented there. Because I just looking through some clippings on COP and oceans last night, it's easy to come up with people with ocean advocates saying, well, the forest got all the money again. And if you want to get into a zero-sum game with forests full of charismatic megafauna, you may win, but I think you both lose. Whereas if you just push away, so I think in some ways that thing I was saying at the beginning about integrating the ocean into all the work packages, that's definitely a way to go. And of course, there are ocean-specific things like shipping, which need a higher profile. I think shipping. I think frankly the IMO gets away with a lot, and I think shipping should be pushed a lot harder in these agendas. But I think saying you must put the ocean center stage is self-defeating and at best self-limiting.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Oliver, on that front. I mean, you mentioned that it kind of almost like streamlining the ocean into other aspects of the climate debate is a better route forward. And in fact, as you said, it's actually included in the Glasgow Pact, but potentially just kind of copy paste and drop. But even that means it's being copied and pasted on from, and it isn't cut. And it was also it's included. Marine ecosystems are included in the preamble. I think there's also the talking about the potential as carbon sinks, and you mentioned shipping there. The Clydebank Declaration of 19 countries. On shipping decarbonization is an encouraging sign as well. So there are some, there's some progress. But sorry, Nelly, you wanted to react as well.
Well, I was just going to say I completely agree with your statement, Oliver. And I think one of my biggest notes throughout, covering sort of oceans at COP was that why do we have this one big day around oceans, right? Where really it should be integrated through conversations, through different negotiations, like on a consistent basis. Otherwise, it kind of gets this one spotlight, but then you kind of forget about it. And I completely agree with that. And again, there was significant movements, as you said, around sort of shipping decarbonization. There was the Clydebank Declaration, which is actually, aiming to be more Paris aligned than what the IMO currently has right now. So that was great. But again, sort of language around that declaration was slightly fuzzy. There was no sort of concrete sort of next steps. And I think that's sort of how do we actually implement all of these? How do we make them actionable? And I think that's what I'm most interested in seeing is how are we actually going to get these going?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, running out of time, unfortunately, it's been a great conversation. But maybe just to conclude, maybe each of us can talk a little bit, just like maybe the one or three key things that really need to happen now to turn these pledges into action. Oliver, would you like to start?
I think finding ways to put ocean aspects of climate firmly into NDCs will definitely help. I think pushing for a full consideration of the ocean in the global stocktake. The global stocktake is what UNFCCC is meant to do next, and it's going to be an odd process. We've never been through one before. I'm not sure any of us quite know how it's going to turn out, but I think bringing out both ocean sinks and also shipping in the stocktake will be a very important thing. So I think that would be the place to focus, to generally sort of like, as it were, to have a rising tide that floats all boats, ocean and otherwise. That's where I would go, the stocktake.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Oliver. Nelly, your key, actions in terms of, what do we need to do to turn these pledges into real solutions?
That's really funny. That was actually going to be my one thing, is that ocean action needs to be incorporated in nationally determined contributions much more. I mean, right now there are, I think, 54 NDC submissions that do kind of mention the ocean, but I think it was really only the Seychelles this time that came out and said, we're actually putting blue economy and blue carbon in our considerations, and we're working to really figure out how that makes sense. And so I agree with that. I think again, bringing more, just having people in these conversations who are actually being affected and making sure, those frontline communities are part of these solutions is absolutely integral to making sure these things are implemented, not just implemented, but implemented in a way that is actually effective and actually addresses the cause concerns, the regional cause concerns, because everything is different. Small island developing states are not a monolith. They're extremely different and have quite unique needs. So I think that also is key to any effective implementation.
Yes, that's right. And that goes back to the point you made earlier about access and representation, really taking seriously the viewpoints from all different parts of the world. And as Oliver said, mainstreaming ocean into these kind of broader conversations. And just for me as well, it's important to keep the pressure on, and our role as an organization that reports and analyzes these kind of things, and others as well, is to kind of push these kind of actors to continue to be transparent, to really report on their progress, and also to kind of keep monitoring those pledges. And of course, to get the business community involved, that is absolutely crucial and was really represented well at COP26. Thanks a lot, Nelly, and thanks a lot, Oliver, for a great conversation. And this concludes the sessions for today at the World Ocean Summit Asia Pacific, but tune in again tomorrow. Thanks a lot, everyone. And of course, ocean.economist.com is where you can find more analysis on the climate ocean nexus. Thanks a lot, everyone.